Hey everyone, welcome back. So this video is going to be a continuation from the last video. Recapping what we covered in there, we did a brief introduction to the JPA one-to-one relationships, and we covered the unidirectional and bidirectional versions of that. And we covered on some light JPA rules around using the one-to-one annotation. We did a quick code demo. And we covered the foreign key setup with the one-to-one relationship for both unidirectional and bidirectional. Now, in this video, we're going to cover off the other things that we mentioned in that first video. So we're going to explain the difference between mappedBy and the join column annotation, and we're also going to look at handling optional relationships with using a join table. So let's get into it. So recapping our entities. So we've got an employee entity, and in the last video we set up this. So we had a one-to-one relationship with a workstation. So that is one employee can have one workstation. And the workstation also knew of the employee. So this is a one-to-one bidirectional relationship. And we defined the owning side of this relationship is on the employee side, and we know that because the mappedBy annotation refers back to the workstation variable on the employee entity. So that's the mapping there. And based off this, we know the employee is the owning side, which means the foreign key will get added to this employee entity. And we saw that when we ran the test. So we saw the table got created and the foreign key got added to the employee table. So let's cover the first point, right? So mappedBy and join column. So we just mentioned what mappedBy does, but what about the join column annotation? So the join column annotation goes on the owning side of the relationship. So that will be on our employee entity in our case. And what we can do is we can define what we want our foreign key to be. So JPA has got some defaults where it takes the entity name and adds an ID to it. So we saw when the table got created, it generated this for us, the workstation ID. So it split this based off the camel case and said, okay, we're gonna basically do that, and then stick on ID on the end, and that's referring to the workstation ID in here. So if we undo this. And let's say, for example, we want to make this, WS ID as a foreign key. Then we can say the name is equal to that. And if we rerun our tests, we'll see when the table gets created, the foreign key on our employee entity, which is the owning side, has a WS ID set as a foreign key. So let's have a look at SQL output. So there we go. So there's our tables. We see the foreign key on the employee entity is WSID, which is what we set with the join column annotation, and there's a constraint getting added as well. So that's pretty much the mappedBy versus join column. The mappedBy always goes on the inverse side or the referring side entity, and the join column goes on the owning entity or the owning side of that JPA relationship. So that will be this done. Now, join table. That's so in our case, right? If we look at our test case, we've got an employee and we've got a workstation. So we've got a one-to-one relationship there, but there might be a case where we might have an employee, right? But they might not have a workstation. So in that case, our foreign key referring to a workstation will be null. And one way to sort of get around having to have a null in there as a foreign key is to create a join table. Now there's reasons to do this and reasons not to do this. One possible way is to use a join table, which eliminates not using null values. Join tables are used a lot in other entity relationships that we'll get into in other videos, like many-to-many relationships, but in this video we're just going to focus on the one-to-one relationship with the join table. So if we run this, we'll see our employee instance gets created, and we have a null set for workstation. So there it is, right? So employee, and this comes back at workstation null. So let's look at adding a join table, right? So let's get rid of this for now. We don't need a join column anymore. And for the join table, you define that on the owning side. So that is the employee side. We know that based off the mappedBy set on the referring side. So that's our employee. Our employee is the owning side of the relationship. So join table. And in here, what we do is we say the name. So that's the name of the joining table. And we can call that EMP workstation. And then we want to give it a join columns, which is, then we define our owning side of this join table. So the join column owning side. We give it a name, and this will be, we can say employee or EID, or we'll give it employee EID. And the reference column for this is ID, or in our case, this employee ID up here. And then we want the inverse join columns, which is equal to join column. And then this is similar to our first one, but this is now referring to the inverse join column, though that is the referring side of this relationship. So that's the workstation. So workstation ID is our column name. So name equals workstation ID, and the reference column is ID as well. That's referring to this workstation ID up here. And then that is everything we need to then create a join table for this. And so if we rerun this, we'll see our join table gets created, and the foreign keys that we saw before an employee wouldn't get added. So let's see the SQL this creates. So we've got our join table that gets created here, EMP workstation, and we see our employee workstation tables get created, but there's no foreign keys at all, and there's no constraints added to those. It's all added onto that workstation joining table that we defined. So in our case, we still have null printed, right, to our workstation, but that's purely an implementation detail based off our toString auto-generated toString that we've had up here from Lombok. But in terms of our data model, we can facilitate an optional workstation or a one workstation, that is 0 or 1 relationship with an employee and a workstation. So that would do it, I think. That's everything we want to cover. So that will do it for this video, guys. Leave me a comment if you have any questions or want to say thank you or learn something or you didn't learn something. Let me know. Give the video a like, and I'll see you all in the next one.